Let's welcome our first speaker, who's a user experience strategist who speaks and writes on topics related to humor-centric design. So please put your hands up for Katie Swindler.
Thanks so much. It's so great to be here. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, yeah. Come on. Okay, like a little bit more feedback. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, nice, awesome. All right, so I am here to talk to you today about life and death decisions and how designers can help our users make better life and death decisions. Now, before I dig into the topic, I do like to start with a content warning, because we are going to be talking about some heavy stuff. It contains references to war, near-death experiences, medical crises, terrorism, and natural disasters. Please know that every story that I share here today was chosen with the intention to teach. All right? It is my hope that by examining the tragedies of the past, we can better serve our fellow humans moving into the future. Okay, so the first story I always like to start with is about a guy you may have heard of, Neil Armstrong. Yeah? Before Armstrong took the very first steps on the moon, he was a young, hotshot fighter pilot for the US Navy during the Korean War, so this is 1950s. And he flew one of these, an F-9F Panther fighter jet. So he is out on patrol one day, gets into a deadly dogfight with the Koreans, and half of his right wing is shored off by an anti-aircraft cable. Through some truly spectacular flying, he is able to keep his aircraft in the air, but it's only by maintaining a high rate of speed. Okay? He knows if he slows down at all, he's going to go into an uncontrolled roll and crash, which means he can't land his plane, right? So he gets on the radio with the CO, and they decide what he's going to do is he's going to fly back towards the US base, eject out of his plane near the base, basically just let his plane crash into the ocean. So that's what he does. Starts flying back. Now, on his way back towards base, he realizes he has only had the very most basic training in the ejection procedures for the plane he's currently flying. So what does Armstrong do? He pulls out the user manual, and he reviews the ejection procedure while he is flying his broken plane through enemy territory. And by God, the man pulls it off. This is a picture of Armstrong standing in a rice paddy outside the US Naval Base. He's holding the D ring from his parachute in his right hand there. He had just landed in that field. And obviously goes on to do great things, right? I love this story, that this guy has the chill required to read the instruction manual while flying through enemy territory. And as a designer who studies the intersection between stress and design, there was one thing that I really wanted to know when I heard this story, and that is, what did those instructions look like, right? What was their design? So I was actually able to dig it up. This is the instruction manual page from the F-9F Panther fighter jet in the 1950s. And this is a fantastic piece of, let's call it crisis design, right? It starts with an incredibly clear call to action, reduce airspeed if possible, and it has this singular linear set of instructions that goes down the page. It also uses nice short phrases and mostly short words, and it's got a good mix of images and visuals. Research has showed that really helps. And it also has this beautiful use of color, so that red is used to really draw your eye. It's just back in the day of two-tone printing, right, for these manuals, but they use that red really in a really disciplined way to draw your eye to the most important part of each of those illustrations. So there is so much that designers can learn from pieces like this that we can incorporate into all sorts of designs for all kinds of stressful situations. And stress really is what I'm going to be talking to you guys about today. In some ways, it is a great unifier. I mean, every creature on the planet experiences it. But stress changes humans, right? It changes the way we move, it changes the way we act and behave, and it changes the choices that we make. And as designers who are designing experiences and often trying to influence human behavior through the designs that we create, it is essential for us to understand those changes, those biological, neurological changes that are happening in the humans that we're designing for in moments of peak stress, so that we can guide them through those moments and make the most smartest and the best decisions during that time. Now, I did a lot of my research in industries where stress and design are very well studied, so healthcare, aviation, the military. But I also wanted to see what can we take from those high stress, high stakes industries. Are there other ways that we can apply those learnings? There's lots of industries that are designed for stressful people, right? Like day traders or customer service reps. Like that's one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. But you might also be designing just a feature in a product that's made to be used in a moment of peak stress, like right after a car accident. Or maybe you've designed something that shouldn't be stressful at all, but nevertheless, people are coming to your product in a stressed out state of mind just because, you know, the world we live in right now. So the good news is, if a stressed person can use your design, anyone can. The techniques that we're going to be talking about today are only going to make your designs easier for everyone else to use. So that's good news. There are 4 main approaches that I like to think about when thinking about designing for the human stress response. The first we're going to talk about is trying to harness the human stress response. I know it's a kind of an odd thing to think about, but adrenaline rush is a powerful force of nature, and a smart design can actually harness that and put it to use for the user in that moment. Then other times you're going to think about, how do we suppress this, right? How do we reduce it or maybe eliminate it altogether? In the moments where you can't do either of those first two, then you're going to want to think about, how can we protect people in these moments when they are freaking out and running towards danger, right? How can we help in that situation? And finally, calm. Lots of times people turn to their technology in the wake of something bad happening, and in those moments, we want to think about ways that we can calm them down, get them back to their best, most rational thinking selves. So let's start with some specific examples, talking about ways that we can harness that human condition, that those incredible reflexes that are sometimes unleashed in a moment of crisis. Some memes call those dad reflexes. Now, if you Google dad reflexes, you will find hundreds of videos of guys saving their offsprings from injury or certain death through purely reflexive reactions. It is sometimes, fun to think that fatherhood somehow unlocks these superpowers inside of these guys, but the fact of the matter is, they were always inside of them. These reflexes are inside all of us, moms and women and the unchild as well. So, but it's important for us as designers to understand under what circumstances do these instincts help and when do they hurt. So as of the 2012 Olympics, the starter pistols were no longer used to signal the start of a race. And that is in part because a study done by the University of Alberta showed that the runners who were closer to a starter pistol get an unfair advantage in the race, their startle reaction. In fact, the runners get an average of an 18 millisecond head start. And now 18 milliseconds isn't much, but in the world of high performance sports, it can be the difference between silver and gold. But it's important to know that not all types of movements are improved through a startle reflex. For instance, this study, a different study, looked at the difference between arm movements and finger movements under the startle condition. And in the arm movements, you can see that the time goes down, down, down as that startle is introduced. But over here in the finger study, that time flatlines. There is no improvement when the startle condition is introduced. And that's because we are designed to improve gross motor movements, fight or flight, right? Running and punching basically is what we are improving with that startle reflex. And we're actually stealing that energy from our fine motor movements. So we don't get any faster, and in fact, we usually get clumsier when we're under a startle condition, but the power goes to those gross motor movements. So it's important to understand the difference. Now, there are certain designs that can harness these differences, right? So you think about some classics, like the emergency stop button. It's iconic. It's been in use in factories for 50 years around the world, right? And there are things about this design that make it work well in an emergency situation. The first thing is that it is just big, right? It's also got that unique mushroom-headed shape. This is a button that is made to be slapped like you were in a game show. It's taking advantage of the gross motor movement, not requiring that fine motor movement. It's also highly standardized. Standardization is how we get to intuitive design, right? Somebody has seen something a lot, and that's how they know what to do with it immediately. And in fact, the color red is associated with the concept of stop around the world. Even in cultures like China, where red has other cultural significance, it's still very strongly associated with the stop, and it's because of this button. This button in particular is so well regulated around the world, and so standardized around the world that it's developed this sort of collective intuitive association with red and stop. And finally, it's a physical control. Sorry, digital designers. Physical controls are often better, nearly always perform better than digital controls in emergency situations. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can steal as digital designers from these physical controls to improve the usability of our designs. For instance, creating something with a nice singular button, nice and big, large margin for error around that button. These sorts of things can help improve the usability, stealing from what works about those physical buttons into our digital realm. The other thing you want to think about when you're designing to try to harness that stress response is thinking about how can we make our designs more intuitive. Because we rely a lot on our intuition, that sort of like primal instinct, when we get stressed out. And so making our designs more and more intuitive is incredibly important. And so in the medical field in particular, though, there are lots and lots of alarms and alerts that go off. And intuitive design is especially important in alarms and alerts because you need people to react very quickly. They need to know immediately what's happening and be able to react. And yet, nearly every alarm in the medical field is some version of this sound. The electronic beep, right? This is so overused as an alarm and an alert sound that it has been able to build up almost no intuitive meaning. That could mean anything from, your toast is ready to you are toast, right, in a medical sense. So I was really curious as a researcher, like, where did this sound even come from? Well, you may be surprised.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite. Douglas Edwards reporting.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner.
So Doug got it more right than he could have possibly known. Since this time, when that electronic beep was first heard, it has become a background sound of almost all of our daily lives, right? Oftentimes, a beep is the first sound you hear in the morning. And it has only gotten worse as we have added more devices to our day-to-day. Now, on average, an average person is hearing something like 100 alarms a day. 100 alarms a day. And it is even worse in the medical field. There, technicians are hearing critical level alarms every 90 seconds. And again, all of these alarms typically are just some form of that beeping sound, sometimes with different tones, sometimes with different rhythms, but studies have shown they are not at all intuitively understood. So the low quality and high quantity of these alarms, they've created a real problem in the medical field. They call it alarm fatigue. Essentially, medical professionals just stop responding to them. They'll turn off critical alarm systems and then not be able to respond when something actually goes wrong. So a study was done in 2013 that linked this to hundreds of patients' deaths. And so the medical community gathered together and put out a call for help. And that call was answered by people from around the world, designers and sound designers, researchers. And they attacked it from all different angles. Some of them were looking at how to reduce the number of alarms. Some of them were looking at coordinating alarms and creating hierarchy amongst them across different devices. But some of my favorite work was done by a woman named Dr. Judy Edworthy. She was called the godmother of alarm design by the New York Times. And she and her colleagues did some really interesting work creating what they called sound icons. So what they did is they took sounds from everyday life and paired them with associated alert concepts. For instance, the sound of a rising tea kettle might tell you that your patient's temperature is getting too high. That might sound something like this. Short, I'm going to play it again. Okay. So the rattle of a plastic pill bottle might tell you that there's an issue with your patient's medication. And then there's this one. Pretty sure that means the Death Star is attacking. Pretty sure. A little Star Wars humor there. Can never go wrong with that. All right, so these icons were so well they were easy to learn, they were easy to retain, they improved reaction time for clinicians by like 20%. So you're getting that reaction time way down. They were so successful that they actually created a set of these icons and entered them into the new international standards. So you will soon be hearing these sorts of sound icons on medical devices in a year. Hopefully not, in any serious way, but they will start showing up in hospital settings very soon. Now, one thing that Dr. Judy Edworthy, and because I actually got to talk with her, she's a fantastic woman. So she and I were talking, and she brought up the fact that, these icons were largely developed and tested in American and European labs, right? And so we should be cognizant of the fact that these sound icons are not going to be intuitively understood in the same way by every community around the world, right? Like, not everywhere in the world is medicine delivered in a plastic pill bottle, right? And so one of the things that they entered along with the icons into the international standards is standards for testing, so that new icons can be created that are specific to different areas of the world. She thinks that the best way to handle this from a design standpoint is to actually have a group of icons, sound icons that are created for each of the medical concepts. And the thing is, though, as far as Dr. Edworthy and I know, there is no one else continuing this research. So I come here to this international audience and I say, if there is any of you who are interested in continuing this research, especially if you come from Africa, Asia, or South America, these are groups these are continents and communities that need more representation within this body of work and this development and this design. So feel free to reach out to me and I can put you into contact with Dr. Edworthy and you can continue that education. All right, so one more thing that I wanted to cover before I move away from harnessing design. One thing that I was looking at in my research was the use of sound and specifically conversation design and voice commands in emergency situations. I was curious, because this is a growing field for us, right? And I was curious, how does this play out in an emergency setting? Are voice commands ideal interface for emergency situations? So I actually got to talk to this guy, George Salazar. He is a NASA engineer, and he helped develop and test the voice commands used on the space shuttle. So George told me that the voice commands are used primarily in 2 different emergency situations in the shuttle. But primarily, they are used for what he calls third-hand tasks, so non-emergency tasks. They're used if a astronaut is doing extra, outside of the vehicle, they're using the robotic arms, and they need to have both hands on the controls, and they need to keep their eyes on what they're doing. Then they can say things like, camera, pan left, camera, pan up. So they don't have to take their hands off their control. They can do that third-hand task of adjusting the camera while they're continuing to edit the robotic arms. But there are 2 emergency situations in which voice command is used. The one is called dark cockpit. And this is a situation where there's some mechanical failure and the screens within the cockpit are no longer working. Then the astronauts are able to speak to the system, and the system is able to speak back to give the critical information of what's going on in the system so that they can continue to pilot the aircraft. The other situation is even spookier. It's called incapacitated crew. So this is a situation where maybe there's low oxygen or there's some sort of accident and the astronauts are pinned in some way within the vehicle. Then they can use voice commands to hopefully get things back under control so that they can get back and pilot the aircraft again. But outside of these two very specific, I would call these redundancies, he does not recommend that voice command be used in emergency situations. And that primarily has to do with where the technology currently is. So one thing that happens during an emergency situation that makes voice command not ideal is that when people get stressed out, they start shouting, and it saturates the microphones. And so the systems literally just can't hear what the humans are trying to say to them. Also, humans tend to speak faster and have less pauses in their speech when they get stressed. And those lack of pauses are just death for a voice system. Those pauses are when the system switches from listening mode into processing mode and actually takes action. If they never hear a pause, they never switch into action mode, so they never take action. And then also, emergency situations, oftentimes there's a lot of background noise. And so, again, like it prevents the system from hearing the humans and the humans from hearing the system. So for these reasons, it's not usually recommended that voice commands be used for emergency situations. And I actually was able to talk to Jonathan Bloom, who is a conversational designer at Google, and he confirmed in a more consumer-facing situation that they follow the same logic. It's just not an ideal system. Now, it is good for critical backups. So like if somebody is in their car after a car accident and they need to still call 911 if they're pinned in their vehicle or they can't find their phone in the wreckage, right? That is still great for a critical backup, but it's not usually recommended as a primary path. So it's good to know. Okay, we've talked a lot about harnessing the stress design. Let's talk about ways to suppress it. Because usually when we're thinking about designing for stress, we're thinking about ways to reduce or even eliminate it. Even people who design for gaming industry, they are careful about triggering a full fight or flight response because people will freak out and hurt themselves. Now, when you think about designing for a startle effect, there are actually 3 things that go into a startle effect. And as a designer, you can actually manipulate these to reduce the effect of a startle. So the first thing that goes into a startle is novelty. So just how new and unexpected something is. There's also intensity. So sound can be a huge intensifier, right? Like if something's really loud, it's often very startling. But it can also be something that's intensely frightening, like what this poor family is probably looking at. And then the third thing is rise time. So that is how quickly change occurs. So really the best way, the most effective way usually to reduce a startle effect is to introduce a change more slowly. That's usually the best way to control a startle. Now, as designers, we don't always have the ability to change these things about the environment that our users are in. Sometimes that's outside of our jurisdiction. So there is one more way that you can reduce startle effects, and that is through training. Now, training is a specialty of the US military. We have dumped billions, if not trillions, of dollars into figuring out the best way to enable soldiers to perform at peak performance, even in incredibly stressful situations like a war zone, right? So there are techniques that we can actually borrow from how they train military soldiers and think about ways that we can apply them to all sorts of different trainings. Anybody who's training for high performance in a stressful situation. So one of the most important things to really unpack here is the way that humans learn. Okay, so now one way that humans learn is in a classroom setting like this, right? And at a conference. And when you learn something in a classroom setting, you are primarily learning this information in your prefrontal cortex, where your logic and reason sit. That's right in the front of your forehead. Now, humans are unique. We are the only creatures on the planet that can hear a story about somebody being an idiot and learn not to do that thing ourselves, right? Now, the other way that humans learn is by doing. This is how most creatures on the planet learn. When we learn by doing, that is stored in our experiential memory. This is what forms our intuition. This is what forms the basis of our intuition. And that intuition lives in our hippocampus, in our midbrain. That sits just above our spinal cord, right in the centers of our heads. And when we learn things here, those memories are stored much closer to our primal core. So what's really interesting is that the blood moves differently in our bodies when we have a stress response. So we talked a little bit about, physically the blood moves and it pulls away from our extremities into our core muscles, and that has the effect in our bodies of making our fingers cold and clammy and clumsy, and it superpowers our gross motor muscles for running and punching. Now, in our brain, a very similar thing is happening. The blood moves away from the outer zones where things like our prefrontal cortex and our logic and reason are stored, moves in towards the middle. So it's pumping oxygen into our hippocampus. That means that in times of high stress, our intuition gets a megaphone, while our logic and reason gets very hard to hear. So this is a phenomenon that soldiers sometimes refer to as the fog of war. Right? And it's one of the reasons why it is so important that these soldiers are trained on their feet, often with a weapon in their hands. This is how the lessons get learned about when the right times to shoot, or more importantly, when not to shoot. Right? Those are the lessons we want them to learn well. And they need to learn those not in a classroom setting like this, but on their feet. So these are things that we can borrow again, for training all sorts of people for all sorts of performance and high-stress situations. So thinking about, obviously, you want it to be very hands-on. You also want to think about how can we get lots of repetition and really fast feedback so that people know, did I do well or not? Closing that loop and doing it multiple times. It's one of the reasons why simulators are so important. There's some cool simulator products out there today in the lobby area that can help with these. The more realistic, the better. That is the other way that we can really help to solidify this. So when we are creating trainings, one of the things we want to think carefully about is, what are we training into people, okay? So raise your hand if you have done CPR training. All right, keep your hand up if your dummy looks something like this. The mannequin that you trained on looks something like this. Yeah, so this is like the most common CPR mannequin on the market. Now, fun fact, I'm going to share a statistic with you guys, and let's see if you guys can figure out from the statistic, what is this dummy missing, okay? So the statistic is 45% of men receive CPR from bystanders, and only 39% of women will receive CPR from a stranger. So what is this dummy missing? Boobs. Yeah, the answer is breasts. Yeah, this dummy has no boobs. So to properly administer CPR to a woman, you are supposed to rip open her shirt and put your hand directly over her left breast. That's just good technique. Now, lots of people hesitate, right? Like, they are afraid that they are going to be seen to be doing something inappropriate. And in that moment, they hesitate, they freeze. Now, logically, I hope most of us understand that from an ethical standpoint, it's more important to save a woman's life than her modesty, right? But in that moment, when she falls to the ground, it is not our logic and reason at the forefront, it is our intuition. And it feels wrong, and so we hesitate. Now, one of the best ways that we can overcome these situations is to help people during the training, that hands-on training. And so to solve this problem, a group called the United State of Women, along with a creative agency called Joan, created Well Mannequin. It is a low-cost wrap that can be added to any flat-chested dummy to give, trainees a chance to practice their technique on a full-figured figure. This helps people get over their discomfort in the moment. It asks questions, be assured during the training procedure that it is the right thing to do. and ultimately save more people's lives. Now, I don't know if you guys saw the CPR training dummy that's out there from CAE, but I did notice it had breasts, and I was very excited to see it. And they actually said the same thing. Like people, even they were going up to like test it out. They're like, "Oh, what do I do here?" Right? So it definitely, go ahead, go get your hands-on training today, and get over that discomfort, so you are empowered to save more women's lives in those moments. All right, so now, there are lots of times, we would love to harness and suppress stress, but as designers, sometimes it is out of our control. Sometimes things go really, really wrong, and people panic. Now, panic strips us down to our core elements, and it really takes away a lot of the skills that we rely upon to survive in this modern world. Now, I had read lots of research about this phenomena, but it didn't really come home to me until I talked to a friend of mine who shared a very harrowing experience with me. So she was home with her kids one day. It was a nice summer day. She was just like a Saturday. She's just cleaning the house. Her little 4-year-old son's following her around. She's up on the second story, cleaning the bedroom. She steps out of the room for a second. She comes back in the room, and the kid's not in the room. The room is empty, and the screen is no longer on the window. And she said, I knew exactly what had happened. She goes to the window, she looks down, and she can see her 4-year-old son lying still on the pavement 2 stories below. So she is freaking out. She runs downstairs, she runs through the kitchen, she grabs the cordless phone on her way out, and she goes and she kneels by his side. He is breathing, but he is otherwise not responding. And she is losing her mind. And she looks down at the phone in her hand, and her fingers are so stiff, she can barely hold it. And she told me, I will never forget this, she told me, Katie, I couldn't find the 9. She couldn't see it in the numbers. So luckily, her older son had heard her yelling, and he came over to find out what was going on. And so she holds out the phone to him. She says, you have to do it. You have to call 911. So it was her 8-year-old son who called the ambulance that day. He saved his brother's life. Now, the story has a full happy ending. The kid is okay. That was like 12 years ago. The kid is totally fine, full recovery. Going off to college soon. But, every time I tell that story, it brings home to me just how much we lose in that moment, right? In those really panicked moments. Now, the neurochemical that is responsible for this, who is responsible for this? Cortisol. Cortisol is responsible for it. Now, cortisol, I don't want to give cortisol a bad rap. Cortisol is incredibly important to us as humans. We literally would not wake up in the morning without cortisol coming up in our bloodstream, right? Like it is what wakes us up and gets us out of bed. Cortisol is a driving neurochemical. It drives us to take action. But part of driving us to take action is that it changes our decision making. So it pushes us towards faster decision, right? Because it's trying to get us to take action, go. But that, of course, reduces our ability to sort of think through the consequences. It also pushes us towards black and white thinking, which reduces our ability to solve problems creatively. It reduces our ability to learn things, and it reduces our ability to retain the things that we do learn. And finally, it makes us more aggressive, especially to people that we see as being outside of our tribe, right? Or however you define that. So in these situations, especially on the extreme end of the situation, this can lead to poor decision-making in times of stress. Now, what are we supposed to do about it, right? Like, what are we supposed to do about this as designers? So I talked to a woman who thinks about this a lot. Her name's Jackie Wolf. She's the one in front in plaid there. So Jackie is a UX designer and researcher at Michigan Medicine. Now, they are a research hospital. And a researcher came to Jackie with a problem. They had done a study with parents of children who had been diagnosed with cancer and enrolled in a phase 3 clinical trial at their hospital. And the survey came back with some pretty alarming results. So only 50% of the parents could explain the goal of the trial. 66% were unaware they had an alternative. I guess they thought like their kid just wouldn't get treated if they didn't say yes to the trial. And 1 in 5 didn't even realize their child was enrolled. So to understand how something like this can happen, it's important to understand the experience of these parents. So when a child is first diagnosed with cancer, those first 48 hours are a whirlwind. Parents are often in hospitals for days on end. They are sleep deprived. They have just heard one of the scariest things a parent can ever hear, and their brains are practically soaking in cortisol at this point, right? And it is in this state that they are approached by clinicians who ask them, would you consider enrolling your child in a phase 3 clinical trial? Now, clinical trials have taken the survival rate of childhood leukemia from 30% to nearly 90% in the last 50 years. So obviously the upside to humanity is great, right? But would you enroll your sick child in an experiment? Ugh. That is a really difficult question. And from an ethical standpoint, it is critical that these parents understand what it is that they are agreeing to. Ethically, it's really critical. Now, the way that a phase 3 clinical trial works is a child receives a diagnosis and they're asked if they'll enroll in the trial, okay? So if the parent says yes, they are randomly placed in one of 2 arms of the experiment. Some of the kids will get the standard treatment, right? And then the other kids will get the standard treatment plus a slight change, okay? There are no placebo groups in a phase 3 clinical trial. They aren't looking for big changes. Oftentimes they're looking for a 1 or 2% increase. That would be a huge success for most of these types of studies. Sometimes they're just looking for a reduction in side effects. And so if the parent says no, then that is perfectly fine, and the kid still gets the standard treatment. Now, I just explained phase 3 clinical trials using a chart that Jackie and her team designed. This is the original chart that was given to parents. Yeah, I always get gasps, yeah, right? This was originally what was given to parents to explain the trials. So you can see what the issue is here. Now, having this as her starting place and knowing how important this work is, when Jackie was first setting out to tackle this as a design challenge, she wanted to make sure she got it right. So she turned to an old friend, the library. She hit the stacks. She looked at all the available research, and when you work at a research hospital, there's a lot of available research. And she and her colleagues pulled out some key insights that really helped guide their work for this project. So the first thing that they found was that video, print, digital, really all of these mediums had fairly equal retention and learning rates. So it really didn't matter. Now, what did make a difference was if the medium was interactive. So, clicking buttons, even turning pages improved learning and retention rates. It also helped to have a mix of words and visuals, just like the manual we were looking at the beginning. It helps to break up the content. That's pretty basic content design 101, right? But breaking it up into bite-sized chunks really helped. And putting a human lens on it, so having a conversational tone. And having characters within the learning materials that people could sort of relate to, that really helped retention. So Jackie and our team put all of these insights together and came up with what I think is actually a pretty clever solution. They created a comic. So this follows all the research, right? It breaks up the information into all of these different panels that they're clicking through, and they can click back using the navigation at the top. It chunks up the information into literal speech bubbles, and it lends itself to a very conversational tone, right? So they just storyboarded out a conversation between parents and a doctor so that they could get all of their questions answered. And they also drew the people. They're almost like icons, right, rather than illustrations. And they did that very purposefully to sort of invite the viewer to project themselves onto those parents. So I think this is a really great example of taking all of the research that is available and applying it to this really human-centered design approach. All right. So finally, we are at calm. When the moment of stress has passed, like I said, sometimes we don't get them as designers, right? Like they don't turn to whatever the thing that we designed is until the aftermath. So there's still plenty that we can do in those moments to help calm people down. So the first thing to know, because I'm a science girl, so the science of calming down, okay? So the way that, when you have an adrenaline rush, right, it is dumped into your bloodstream within milliseconds. But it actually takes quite a bit of time to get those chemicals back out of your bloodstream. The adrenaline and the cortisol stay in your system for 20 minutes to up to 2 hours. The adrenaline gets through it a little bit faster than the cortisol. And so the effects of those neurochemicals, they can be affecting people's behavior through that entire period. And we've talked about them, right? Reduced cognition, increased aggression, poor decision making. And so as designers, we want to get people through this period as fast as possible. We want to get them back to their best selves. And there are actually things that we can do, as simple as aesthetic changes, honestly, that can have a measurable effect on the amount of time it takes people to calm back down after emergency. So one really simple change came out of some research from an MRI study that looked at the difference between how humans react to objects with curves versus objects with sharp corners. And there's a measurable difference in how people react to these different objects. Those pointy corners, they remind our inner protector of dangerous things, and the curvy lines, they remind us of soft, safe spaces. And so doing something as simple as rounding the corners on your buttons and boxes, right? That can have a small but cumulative effect at reducing that stress and the cognitive load of that. Also, order and clarity. Humans love to know that everything has a place and everything's in its place. When we can see it all, right, that gives us a lot of a really good sense that we have it, we have it handled. It gives us a sense of control, and it has a very calming effect. And also the incorporation of natural elements. So this can be, natural color palettes, pictures of nature, animations that are inspired by these slow movements of waves or wind blowing through leaves. These can have a very calming effect. And it's one of the reasons why they are so popular in all of these calming apps that are on the market today. You often see these sort of natural elements incorporated. There's a huge body of work to study the beneficial focus and health benefits of natural imagery. So you can leverage all of that as well within your own work. Now, beyond these just aesthetic changes, which, as I mentioned, are small but can be cumulative, one of the biggest things that we can do as designers is to enable human connection. Because in a moment of stress, this is actually where the biggest impact can come. Humans really need other humans when things go wrong, and it really drives a lot of our behavior when we're in an emergency situation. So if you're trying to anticipate what people are going to do in an emergency situation so that you can sort of put them onto the path of the best option for them, it's important to understand the instincts that are driving this. We actually are still learning about this. Even as recently as in the wake of 9/11, there was a lot of study done in how people reacted after the terrorist attack in New York. Now, according to the conventional wisdom at the time, basic fight or flight, the anticipated movement was that, from ground zero, you would just see people fleeing that area, right? Like moving directly away from the point of impact. But when they went back and looked at how people actually moved in the wake of the terrorist attack, that wasn't what they were seeing. People did run, but they didn't necessarily run away. What they were doing is they were running toward their loved ones. So parents would run toward their children's school to go get them out of school, even if it meant going closer to ground zero. People would see people hurt and bleeding near the buildings, and they would run forward to help them get to safety. And coworkers would gather together as a group before leaving the scene, altogether. And once they started looking for it, sociologists found this phenomena again and again in cultures around the world in response to tornadoes and floods and hurricanes, all that sort of stuff. And this instinct actually has a protective it kind of creates a mental shield for humans. So they did a study on children who had survived the Blitz in World War II. And the kids who had stayed with their parents in London, even though they were much closer to the war, and you would think that they would endure more trauma, they actually had much lower rates and less severity of PTSD than the children who were sent to the countryside to live with distant relatives. Being separated from their parents in this traumatic time was actually more damaging than staying in the war zone. And we see this same phenomenon in soldiers up through modern day wars. The soldiers who experience traumatic events with their unit have much lower rates and severity of PTSD than those who suffer similar things but by themselves. So it's important to understand just like how critical that human element is. Now, not every tragedy and traumatic experience that somebody experiences is a group trauma, right? Especially when we're talking about things like disease, right? That can be a very lonely experience for somebody, especially if they're the only person in their family who has that specific affliction. So I talked to designer Alex de Russell-Baker. Now, she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in her 20s. That's fairly unusual. Most people are diagnosed in childhood. But she was diagnosed in her 20s, and she is actually a UX designer. When she was first diagnosed, it was really difficult for her, and she found that it actually put quite a bit of distance between herself and her family. And she said it was like an elephant in the room, especially between her sister and her father, because this disease came with so many things that she needed to do and so many numbers she needed to watch, and so much more attention she needed to pay to things like what she ate and when she ate, things like that. And it was really driving a wedge between her and her support system, the important humans in her life. And so, she's a designer. And so she started processing by creating these posters. And she created one poster to sort of encapsulate one element of her new reality. And then she would post them on Instagram with these essays, sort of describing, what the poster meant and where she was going from there. And they became so popular, she ended up creating an installment in Edinburgh, where she's from. And she said, if you break an arm and you're walking around with a splint, people say, "Oh, what happened?" And it makes a nice icebreaker. These posters became my broken arm and what people came to talk to me about. And what she found was not only did it help her connect to a community of people who were undergoing the same situation as her, but these posters also opened a conversation pathway between herself and her family. So it really helped create and create a support structure for her as well. And her work was so good it caught the eye of the medical community, and they approached her about creating a system by which they could be teaching the new life systems to people with type 1 diabetes. And so she's actually creating a card set, I think just launched this year. So it's another great example of a really human-centered design, really understanding the need for human connection in those moments, and creating a product that really enables them. Not for people to just learn about themselves, but also to create conversation between themselves and their family members. So as designers, we are not always on the front lines, but if we approach our work carefully and mindfully, we can be there for people in the moments that matter most. We can protect them, we can help calm them, and we can help harness the true potential inside of them, helping them to do truly amazing things. Thank you. Now, I am assuming you all are nerds like me, so if you want homework, I have some. Feel free to take a picture. These are some of the sources and additional readings that I highly recommend. These informed this talk. They also informed, I'll give one more second for pictures, they also informed my own book that I wrote on this topic, Life and Death Design, if you want to dig into it more. You can also take a picture of that or follow that QR code to my publisher's website and save 15% with Katie15. So yeah, there you go. You're welcome.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
Big up.
Thank you.
So I also have my life and death situation. Every morning when my phone alarm rings is the iOS default ringtone, and that stresses me out. So it should be probably changed.
Yes.
All right, we have a few questions for Q&A, and we have one pinned, if I'm right. So what sounds are considered stress reducing, and are these used in design?
Yeah. You know, you mentioned the awake alarm. My husband recently changed to the sleep. They have a whole new sleep system that they have launched in iOS that gives you like a sort of a bedtime. Yeah. And then it also has custom alarms that are more gentle. So, you know, we talked about reducing a startle effect, right? The best way to reduce a startle effect, does anybody remember? Introduce a change more slowly, right? Introduce the change more gradually. So the sound that wakes us up in the morning now, I call it the Tweety bird, because it starts out and it's like, ba-da, and it like gets slowly louder, and then it starts to have these like little like high notes, like dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. They sound like little Tweety birds. And so that like gradual you know, increase is very important. Also thinking tonally, so major versus minor chords. Right? We actually react very extremely to major versus minor chords. There's also, you know, dissonance is extremely difficult for humans to deal with. And so that does change a bit from culture to culture, depending on the music that you've grown up with. But primarily, like major chords and tones that are in major chords have a more positive impact than minor chords. So those are some tricks that you can use.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. The next question. In movies, emergency evacuations from starships are associated with debilitating alarm sounds, like woo woo. Is that good practice, or does it help crowds to react right?
No, yeah, no, it's terrible. It makes great television, right? Like, because the sound designers are using those sounds to increase the tension of the scene, right? They're not best practice. You need to be attention-getting. You need to get people, you know, you need a sense of urgency, but absolutely the type of things that you see in movies are almost always over the top and more about the sound design than they are about best practices for alarms. One of the worst problems with those types of alarm systems is that there's so much conflicting information. The avionics industry in particular has done extensive research on trying to reduce the amount of conflicting alarms. It's one of the reasons why they don't actually recommend spoken alarms. Like, you know, we looked at all those intuitive icons. I didn't talk about this a lot in the talk, but it's not really recommended to switch all the way over to like a system that talks to you, right? There's lots of drawbacks to that. The first one is not everybody speaks the same language, right? And so designing systems in one language, it's like, well, you might be around people that don't speak that language. It can help sometimes, but the other drawback to them is people are often need to speak to each other in an emergency situation, and talking on top of talking makes it very difficult to hear either of them. Whereas if you've got alarms that are designed at different levels with different types of sounds, you can have more layering of that information that is still cognitively processed. And so that's why you want alarm design that has high tones, mid tones, low tones, because also people at different ages have different tones that they can hear. Men and women hear different tones differently. So you want a range of it, and then you want to think about, okay, like what are all the layers of sounds and how can they work together? So in that, the icons I played for you guys, you had both the alert sound, that beep, 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 and you had the intuitive icon, the or the right? Those sounds, they were layered together to be both attention grabbing and informative. And you need those layers in good sound and alarm design.
Amazing, thank you. After this fantasy question, here's a real-life example of a potential life or death situation. How to help a deaf person who can't speak well in a car accident with sound help call?
Ugh. Yeah, I mean, it's all about redundancies in these situations, right? So it's a really difficult design problem, because ideally that person, it has systems within their vehicle that are not sound-based, right? text messaging or other things like that. So it's all about having those redundant systems. It's not just one. I mean, the more that we think about inclusive design, the more we're thinking about widening the scope of who we're designing for. And once we start widening that scope, it gets better for everyone. So, another thing going back to alarm design, most alarm systems are auditory, primarily because auditory is 360, right? Where visual, it's more like what's in front of you. And so to design alarms for the hearing impaired, a lot of times what you're doing is you are flashing lights and trying to bounce that light around the room so you're getting a similar 360 coverage that you get with sound. You're literally trying to mimic the sound, what's good about sound. And so, but that helps everyone, right? Because like, I don't know if you guys have ever been in a situation where I actually haven't heard the alarm, but I've been in like a really crowded room or something, or a concert, and I didn't hear the alarm, but I saw the lights, right? And that like draws your attention to it. So once you start creating more and more layers of inclusive design, it starts working better for everyone. So thinking about layering those is usually how I approach that type of design.
Amazing, thank you. The next question, how could you emulate a stressed person when testing a product?
I love this one. So there was a couple of things that I ran into in my research. One of them, I talked to somebody who works at Ford, the motor, the car company. And they have, they call it like the dome, and they have built a huge 360 dome that they can put a full-size car inside of. And then they hire, test participants to come in and sit and drive. And sometimes they'll drive for hours on end until they fall asleep. And then they're like starting to nod off, and then and they like are hooked up. So like the scientists, like the testers know when they're like on the verge of sleep. And then it's a 360 situation where they've got like projected onto the screen, right, like the surroundings. And then like right as they're like about to nod off, they like push a button, and like a deer will like leap in front of the car, and the person like has to like react to it, right? That's like one of the ways that they're testing those stressful situations and like seeing how sleep and recent wakefulness affect reaction time. Another really fun one that I think is more usable, because not all of us have Ford money to build domes, testing domes. One thing that I talked to a group of designers who work on medical devices that are often used in war zones. And one of the ways that they test those devices is they have a test OR set up, and they bring in medical professionals to use the devices in situ, and they pump in the sounds of war, like like bombs going off and people yelling and helicopters flying overhead. Again, sound really speaks to like our inner, like our inner knower, and it goes straight to our stress response, because it is such an important part of our intuitive responses to danger. Sound really like alerts us to things. So we react to sound differently than we react to visuals. And so having like a really realistic soundscape within a testing environment can really pump up the stress without putting anybody in actual danger. Now, all that being said, I will give a caveat that it's very important that you recruit very carefully for any test participants that you're going to put under stress, because there are certain communities that have high rates of PTSD and things that can be triggered within a purposefully stressed environment. So, warn people, tell people what they're getting into, and also be cognizant about even like asking people to speak about past traumas and things. Like, you're researchers, you're not therapists, so like, approach those very carefully and make sure that it's really necessary. I often encourage people who play in that space to think about creating sort of an ethical review board, similar to what they do in universities and academia, to review like, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, is what we're going to get out of this research worth the stress that we are putting the participants under? So those are some things that I like to talk about, so people can consider them when they're thinking about stress testing.
Cool, thank you. And the last question. Is a stress or distressed condition part of the accessibility standards? And if so, why? If it's not, should it be?
I guess it absolutely should be. I mean, I don't know about one accessibility standard, right? Like
There are multiple.
Yeah, exactly. So I definitely think it's something that should be considered. I think of it as a type of accessibility design personally, but you know, I don't know. I don't know of a particular company that has it. Though I will say, even at Allstate, we are experimenting with having part of our pattern library. We have crisis patterns. So, you know, I talked at the beginning about, you know, the emergency stop button and how do we translate that into the digital realm. So we have at Allstate we have a crash detection feature on our app, so that if somebody's in a car accident, the app can say, "Oh, I think you've been in a car accident. Do you need to call 911? Do you need to be connected with an agent to help you through a claims process?" And so in that situation, we know people are going to be under duress, and so we increase the size of the buttons, we increase the size of the fonts, we lower the reading level so that the words are simpler and shorter. We increase the contrast ratio to whatever the Web3 like peak. I think it's like a AAA standard as opposed to the AA that we normally use on our products. And so those are the sorts of changes that we make. And then we've standardized all of that, and we've got, you know, buttons and text and, you know, certain types of patterns that we have for other situations, and we've created a set of controls that are used on our products in those emergency features.
Amazing. And now the last question for real. So can the audience get the slides with sources, please? And if so,
yes.
where?
Yes, actually, can the booth switch me back to my to the talk? Because I actually have, if you go to lifeanddeathdesign.com, feel free to take a picture of this. My slides are available there. You can also, if you guys want to nerd out about this topic, this is a personal passion of mine. Happy to talk about it. I love to hear people's stories. If you guys are working on something that you would think would be good to feature in a future talk or something, I would love to connect with you all. So please find me.
Amazing, Katie. Thank you so much. Give it up for
everybody.
Katie.
Yeah.